Dungeon Masters of Reddit, what is the most surprising thing your players have done in game? I made my party start the game as common as in a non-heroic kind of game. The party, as you would expect, struggled at first but had a general idea of what they wanted to do, and as they leveled up, you could see how their actions affected their class choices. Inevitably we ended up with our fighters, priest, rogue and so on, all but one of the group. Let's call him Jeff. Jeff spent 12 levels on expert, another non-hero class, and was, in comparison to the others, pretty useless. Jeff's character was bullied and berated for the entire game. Fast forward a while, and over the course of this game that has taken the better part of half a year, Jeff has been reading up on trebuchets and has become something of a real-life master of knowledge on the subject. His character has been dumping points in knowledges and engineering and been reading books on trebs too. He wanted to be some kind of siege expert. Jeff's character got sick of the group and found a cunning way to load the group into his magical treb whilst they slept and he took watch. Jeff's character fired the party out of treb, thus ending the game as none of them had any kind of slow fall abilities and took a healthy amount of damage that they didn't survive. Playing a Rokugan campaign about 10 years ago, 3.5, and there were 8 players and myself as DM. Mostly a homebrewed world full of epic samurai battles and giant monsters and silly situations, as is per usual. Well, the group decided to brainstorm and get the drop on my BBEG, an evil villain named Hoshi, way earlier than I planned. It was a well executed plan and was impressively well thought out, though I warned them that even if they were able to pull this off, they still might not be able to beat him. I thought to myself that I wasn't going to hold back. But maybe if the whole party wiped, I'd let them actually wake up in a dungeon or something after being defeated and left for dead. Well, the party actually starts whooping his butt, like they are spanking the ever-loving crap out of him. But this guy was designed to be taken on many levels later, and I was feeling a bit like pushing back, so I had him perform to a good amount of his full potential to make it more challenging. I mean, he is the main villain, so far, right? So he couldn't just be destroyed. Well, I ended up being a bit too harsh probably and caught all but one player. Everyone's pee that they are down but are loudly cheering for our remaining hero to frick him up. Now this player had just leveled up before the fight and had remained pretty quiet up until this point, just attacking. I had no idea they were sitting on a trump card. As it became his turn again, he showed me his sheet and said, "I'm going to do this." The sheet indicated he had the ability to sprout flaming wings and fly, so I told him to roll. Natural 20. So he fires his wings up and starts flying around the map, and I start rolling horribly in retaliation. Hoshi just can't seem to keep up, while the player keeps dropping high teens with his attacks on him. He runs his abilities course and drops to the ground, hurling fire at the bad guy. He drops the BBEG down to a lower HP and I indicate he looks like he's wearing down. The room is silent except for my descriptions and the player's actions. Out of magic and painfully weak himself, he says, "I'm going to throw my katana at him and try to kill him." I tell him the DC and he rolls 19. That's a critical hit. I tell him to roll to confirm 20. Everyone starts freaking screaming at him. It's awesome. Oh well, I think to myself. Then I describe the player hurling his katana at the BBEG just as the villain has begun his taunting speech on how he's going to kill him. The blade goes through his mouth and out the back of his head and fuses him to a tree trunk. His lifeless eyes glaze over and he is silent forever. I had to end the session right there because it was so intense. Everyone was seriously losing their minds over it and I was super proud of the player for just going for it. I was a newish DM at the time playing Hot DQ. Players are in the swamp on their way to the castle. In my description I say there is nasty swamp gas emitting from the bubbles within the water. They proceed to fill their bag of holding with it and use it as an air balloon to lowly float over it to avoid encounters. I allowed it because it was creative and hilarious. One player says they want to huff the swamp gas. What? His player huffs it to lower the balloon and I decide to have some fun with the 10,000 magical side effects table. He ends up summoning a buttload of quippers, piranhas, into the water below them. Another player tries and his blood turns to acid, but functions normally. He jumps off the rope and dives so the quippers bit him and they all died. It was a great session and the only time my players have ever really been creative with the cards I deal them. Yes, I now know the bag of holdings properties. But this happened maybe a month into me ever playing. I've been our group's forever DM. Swamp gases farts. My players huffed magic farts. I DM'd a one shot that used pre-existing characters. As in, people had been playing these characters in different campaigns and had grown somewhat attached to them. But the actual encounter wrapped up in one session. I misjudged the timing and the whole thing took about 3 hours, rather than the 5 I had planned. So people were just goofing around in character. The moon druid at our table was obsessed with finding a pet of his own, and decided to pick a fight with the bard, who had delivered a killing blow to a displacer beast that in his mind he had already nicknamed Kitty and was going to animal handling his way to a long-lasting friendship. All this despite the fact that a displacer beast is he kept picking at the halfling bard, challenging her to a fight, basically putting on a big show of intimidation to try and ensure that he'd be allowed to finally get a pet for himself in the future. It was good-natured around the table, but they're both quite RP heavy players and so they really leaned into it. Eventually, the bard just says, "Okay, sure, I generally discourage PvP play. In fact, I'll generally drop a rock on whoever instigates it at the earliest opportunity, not at my table, folks." But they both seemed into it and the other people at the table didn't mind, so I'll let it happen. The moon druid in question had been warned about my thoughts on PvP play, but hey, this is what one-shots are for. Oh boy, the bard destroyed this moon druid, like, pasted him. It wasn't even a contest. Through a combination of incredible rolls on the bard's part and sucky rolls on the part of the druid, she took down a full-on brown bear, then the rest of the druid's hit points, over the course of about 20 minutes of play. When he got down to about 10 hit points and asked one of the onlookers to heal him, they said no. The druid asked to stop the fight. I said that was down to the bard. The bard chose not to. Cue our peaceful halfling bard going straight up Dexter on the druid, then calmly wiping off her rapier and saying, "So, we done here?" The druid player didn't push for much PvP play after that. A member of the party made some very poor decisions and wound up getting turned into a worm by a powerful local wizard whom he'd pee off repeatedly. Nearly all of my adventures included a got-hair wizard NPC who was my source of in-game discipline. I'd generally turn you into something or lock you in a magic cell, which meant that you missed out on the rest of the adventure and the associated XP. You'd be turned back to normal by the end. It didn't happen too often. I only invoked it when someone was being a turd and ruining the game for everyone else. Usually people would take this as a cue to go do something else for a while, but not this guy, who we'll call Dennis because his name was Dennis. He insisted on role-playing as the worm for hours. I check in on him regularly and ask what he'd like to do next. His response every time was, "I eat dirt." It was one of those stupid things that just gets funnier every time. He had us falling out of our chairs by the end of the game. 20 years later, most of us are still friends, and we still laugh about that day. Reminds me of when I first learned how stupid guidance was as a cantrip, and by mistake I said, "I touch myself for guidance," which had everybody dying in laughter, and has been constantly repeated by others. My players destroyed the known world in my first session. The players decided to break into the vault room of a benevolent king and steal not just some gold, but all of it, including some cursed family heirlooms to the king. This in turn transformed normal benevolent king into the embodiment of revenge and darkness. The players barely escaped with their lives as darkness and demons swept the land. They sailed to a southern portion of the continent to meet up with the other Long who had organized a resistance and set up a place for refugees. The players upon arriving informed the guards that they had information as to why darkness was swallowing the land and were taken right to the throne room to see the king. After some explaining of what happened, the king was about to send them on a mission when our ranger said aloud, "I try to throw a discarded chicken bone in his mouth." I tell him to roll for it, setting the check at 18 in my head. The bastard rolled a 19 and the bone flew directly into the king's throat. The king quickly keeled over and died. A silence fell over the room and after a few seconds his nearest advisor shouted, "The crown is mine." A large struggle ensued in the throne room, everyone vying for the crown or trying to kill the players. The players all rush out of the throne room to see the darkness and demons rushing over the castle walls, and fled to their ship to sail to the safety of the open ocean. With the king dead, no one else had the power or military resources to fight the scourge, and the continent was lost. When the session started, I honestly didn't think there was a way to destroy the world, but by God they found a way. All I could do after was sob laugh for like half an hour, and that's why I had to make an entire new world for the following week. Henderson scale 2+. My players made it to a dragon's lair, killed all its kobold followers, and attempted to sneak up on it. They failed miserably, and the dragon had them in its grasp. I was prepared to initiate combat but gave the party one shot. The dragon would have probably killed everyone. The dragon said any last words and the bard immediately dropped to one knee and proceeded to weave a tale of how the party traveled far and wide searching for a dragon worthy of their allegiance. He nat 20'd a charisma check and the dragon crit failed insight. The dragon deputized the party. Of course, the campaign then took an abrupt turn because the party now swore allegiance to a dragon and had to do its bidding. The moment I mentioned there was an enchanter's shop in town, they all plotted behind my back to rob the place blind between game sessions. Basically went like this. Me. Okay, so before you all leave town to head along to your next quest, anything anyone wants to pick up before you go? P1. I wanna go to the enchanter's shop. Other players follow. Now this was somewhat strange because they usually split up in towns to different shops. So I figured, oh hey, they are finally making things easy for me once. Nope. What proceeded was an elaborate plan to knock out the shopkeep and security if there was any, but I didn't think to include it with knockout lipstick with an unwilling shopkeep as they robbed the place blind until I had someone else walk in. I got my revenge though. Had that shopkeep murdered by the guy that came in and all proof of the murder pointed at the players because they bolted instead of trying to distract or play along. Not a DM myself, but a pretty avid player with a couple of good friends. The situation was that my friends and I were escorting a princess to the Shao Empire, and on the way there happened to be a town that was being attacked. The next events were turning out to be brutal, with even the princess's specially trained bodyguard dying in the midst of it. While trying to come up with a plan, we were made aware of a legend of a nearby dragon that could potentially help. I, being a sorcerer, decided that I would probably have the easiest time convincing this dragon to help. When I went to the cave, the dragon was asleep. Waking it from its sleep wasn't really the greatest thing to do, but the city needed help. After waking him up, I was immediately threatened with death unless a tribute could be given. I didn't have a ton of gold with me, so I thought I was just gonna die on the spot. However, I remembered that through past endeavors, I had about 5 pounds of holy leaf, Pathfinder version of weed. So I proceed to hype this dragon about the holy leaf and roll a 5-pound blunt for him with a cloak I was wearing. To my surprise, the DM allowed this and it worked. I hooked a dragon on weed and I rode him back to save the city. While this is happening, my DM and the rest of the party are losing their crap because I just fed a noble dragon a blunt the size of a small baby in order to save the city. Puff the magic dragon. It was suggested I share this popular post from a day or two ago. For those not in the know, Fizzlepop Throat Punch is the name of my 10-year-old daughter's gnome monk. Mayor of the town meets with the party to thank them for their help in thwarting an attack on the city. Mayor, and what's your name, little one? Fizzy, you don't know who I am? Mayor, can't say I do. I'm sorry. Fizzy, so, you're saying you've never heard of me? Mayor, shakes head. Fizzy, gestures for him to come closer. Mayor, takes a knee and leans in. Fizzy, I punch him in the throat. The mayor will never forget the name Fizzlepop Throat Punch. First impressions last. I had a monk that just got a little too good and a little too lucky, and he managed to, secretly, acquire a huge sum of wealth, which he used to buy up all of the grain his host nation was exporting to cause a famine in a country whose leadership the party was trying to take down, causing political upheaval. The plan was to result in him being in control of both countries, and it was working wonderfully, all without the rest of his party not really knowing what was up. It happened over the course of months, and at every turn I thought it was near impossible for him to pull it off, but he always came out victorious. We never got to conclude this, as after a year the game fell apart for personal problems among players, but by then he had 400,000 gold, a network of spies and mercenaries, around 100 ships, and was the largest exporter of grain on the continent, as well as acquiring a hoard of magical items and being the de facto secret ruler of their host country. It was bonkers. Entered a same-gender marriage with a dragon and had kids with it. I was running a slightly modded 3.5 version of the Pathfinder Adventure Path Kingmaker for a gaming group that included my wife. In the adventure path, the PCS goal is to found their own kingdom. It's a very loosely plotted sandboxy adventure. They were around 8th level and had founded their fledgling kingdom. My wife was playing a gnome sorceress and had the highest charisma in the party, so she was the queen. They were in a relatively uninhabited mountainous area nearby looking into rumors of a threat, and I rolled a random encounter with an adult silver dragon. I randomly decided it was female. The dragon had a CR of like 14 or 15, so I knew if it came down to a fight, it was probably going to be a TPK. But they were a mostly good and neutral party, so I figured it would stay a friendly role-playing encounter as long as they didn't do something really stupid. It did. They traded some information to the dragon for some tips about the threat they were investigating, and at the end they invited the dragon to come visit them in their capital city. I figured I'd roll with it, and a couple sessions later I had the dragon come for a visit. At the end my wife invited the dragon to come back and visit whenever it wanted. Over the course of a few sessions, my wife seduced this dragon with the aid of a few very high diplomacy rolls, and eventually convinced it to join her as co-queen of the city. They had a big fancy wedding, and of course determined that the kingdom needed an heir as soon as possible. That session was the only time I've ever needed to reference the book of erotic fantasy for any reason, but I'll be damned if it didn't have a table that told me exactly what the gestation time of a half-dragon gnome baby was. The two of them went on to have 2 more kids and lived happily ever after. At least after they all got together and murdered the crap out of the ancient red dragon that kidnapped the heir toward the end of the campaign. But I'll be damned if it didn't have a table that told me exactly what the gestation time of a half-dragon gnome baby was. I freaking love that specifically random D&D references exist. My friend is always performing ridiculous antics with his horse as a 5e paladin. Apparently paladins can summon their horse anywhere within a small radius of themselves. They can also communicate with their horse telepathically. Here are some quotes from him. I remember sending my horse into a bandit camp, and I cast Speak with Animals on my horse so it could definitely talk to the other horses. I had it try to rouse the other horses into revolution by getting up on top of a hay bale and talking about how the horses are all slaves. Horse had crap sharp persuade skills though, so I eventually just had it scream there was a bear and scattered the horses in a stampede. While the bandits were distracted, I teleported inside their prison cell and freed their prisoner. One time I lowered my horse down on ropes from an airship to read some runes on a Stonehenge for me. I once gave my horse to a hill giant queen as a peace offering. She picked it up and took a bite out of it, killing and summoning it so it disappeared. We managed to convince her that she successfully ate it. I remember I teleported through the keyhole into a guard tower, since the Misty Step Paladin spell lets you teleport anywhere that you can see, and then I was surrounded by guys, so my horse broke down the door and I teleported back onto my horse and ran away. In the first session of a new campaign in my Arabian Nights setting, one of the new players strapped a barrel of high-proof alcohol to his back and then blew himself up in the bazaar while yelling Allahu Akbar. I decided to give him another chance. He decided to play as Elite Barbarian and commit jihad, his words not mine, and ran into a temple of another god and killed 5 people before the guards captured him and hung him in the main square within the next hour. We didn't invite him for any other sessions. Edgier than a +1 sword. I made an encounter where they were headed to an ancient dwarven stronghold. There was a massive army of orcs and goblins in the valley before the fortress. I had planned for them to try to use the old cannons or some nitroglycerine they found to destroy the walls of the valley and block the army. My party decided to use an old mining car they found, fill it with nitroglycerine, and manually pilot it into the enemy camp with some slaves they rescued and blow the army up the greatest raid style. They had this long drawn out attack plan of using one player's screen based attack to deafen the enemy and then to use their ranged weapons and spells to defeat the higher level guys while the slaves defended the cart that was decorated with gold to attract the goblins to it. As a player, we once had a GM plan a 3-session arc of a Dragon Age game around us going through an elaborate hedge maze with lots of puzzles and encounters and plot specific stuff for each character. Think the maze at the end of Goblet of Fire. My character, an irritable but practical elf apostate, took one look at it and decided it seemed like a whole thing. Turned to the party members and said, "I'm going to burn it to the ground. Any problems?" They did not have any problems. I burned it to the ground. The GM had to take a half-hour break to replan the session. There was a room in a dungeon that, when the PCs stepped in, it would start locking itself. Had only one entrance, and thousands of poisonous bats would start filling the room. It was a pretty simple trap. Go in, get the magic key to progress through the dungeon, and get out ASAP. However, they started panicking, and when they decided what to do, the room had already locked itself. Their solution? Grow a giant tree in the middle of the room using the druid's magic. Set it on fire with the mage's fireball. Teleport everyone out using the scroll they just found and wait 5 to 6 hours for the bats to die with the smoke and without oxygen. In the end, they broke the stone door that was created and got the key over a floor filled with dead bats. Never seen such an alternative way to massacre wildlife. One of my wizards was walking through a swamp alone, having been separated from the rest of the party. There were these massive dire wasps, like size of a poodle, flying toward him. He looked over his spell list and then calmly said, "I want to cast Fall slowly." Several nat 20s later, the wasps that were flying toward him gradually lost altitude and plopped harmlessly into the muddy swamp. Runner up. One of my characters had an imp named Waffles. Waffles was a small, dog-sized, bat-like creature who was more or less a cursed familiar. He was obligated to follow direct orders, but he otherwise got into a ton of mischief. He could teleport anywhere within a direct line of sight and his main motivation was to eat birds. He had very rudimentary language. Mostly he just said, "I eat birds." During a fight on a small island with a volcano god, my characters were in way over their heads. Suddenly the guy with Waffles asked, "Wait a second, can't Waffles teleport stuff?" Mind you, Waffles was there, but Waffles was mostly useless in battle. He could bite or scratch people but wouldn't do it without being ordered and preferred to stay out of the fray. It had been previously established that Waffles would occasionally grab things and teleport with things. For example, he'd teleport into a bird cage, grab the bird, teleport across the room, and eat the bird. He also had a habit of teleporting out of grabbing range with people's money, because the money on the island featured birds, so he ended up eating a lot of coins. I was like, yeah, he can teleport. So, he asks if it was a clear night. It was. He looks directly at Waffles and says, "Waffles, I want you to go grab onto that lava monster. Don't let go, and teleport as high and as far as you can go." Bam. Waffles and the volcano god blink out of existence. The party went from having their asses handed to them to just standing around silently on a deserted island, looking at each other. Several minutes later, my party watches as a massive meteor comes streaking down from the sky. They stay on the top of this volcano and watch the big, bad boss slam into the side of the mountain and erupt into flames. They then slogged into the crater because why not? The kicker? They're looking around for Waffles and they find him clinging to a tree. The membranes of his wings burned off, shaking and saying, "I eat bee birds." Near the climax of the final battle, the players saw they were all going to die at the hand of the villain, Icona Grimrand. To prevent this, 3 of my players worked together to allow the other 3 to escape the mountain top and kingdom they were on and within. One of the trio uses hold person and succeeds. Another starts slashing at Icona, and the third had collected multiple Zeus bolts, basically mini nukes in the shape of lightning bolts, and saw his hammer was shaking. When his magic hammer shakes, it means it has absorbed enough souls to give off an explosion of pure chaotic energy. I knew the aftermath would be catastrophic. But I didn't realize the true extent of it all. When he went to use the hammer's blast with the Zeus bolts, I took a second to figure out the blast radius, only to find out that the entire mountain and country was destroyed, along with all the citizens thereof. The fleeing heroes had managed to escape, and the three who gave everything to stop this villain were remembered forever. R.I.P. Razstrashitzel. R.I.P. the Mama. R.I.P. the Papa. All the time when Razstrashitzel fed someone a cheese sandwich with an explosive inside of it, and succeeded. About 1 hour into our first game ever, one of our players made a risky climb about 30 feet to take a peek into a dangerous room. He successfully snuck up to a crack in a rock and didn't alert the enemies in the other room. One of our other teammates says, "I wanna go up too." We say, "I'm sure, but I don't know why." He failed, made a ton of noise, and the enemy in the other room ran over and knocked them both down. This far fall. The first player had 1 health left. The other player died instantly. He took that much damage. He fell on his head, on rock, from 30 feet, and was crushed. I'm not the DM, so we all kind of looked at him like, you are gonna let this happen in the first hour of our first game ever? He didn't know what to, and just let him die and said we can create our own characters next time, since we used the pre-made ones. TLDR. In the first hour of our first game ever, a player made a dumb decision that led to him insta-dying. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.